You are nothing but a keeper of dust and broken dreams." The words sliced through Lyra like shards of ice, delivered with the casual cruelty that had become as familiar as breathing. She felt them settle into her chest, adding another layer to the armor of worthlessness she had built over 23 years of existence. High Priestess Mira stood in the doorway of the sacred chamber, her lips curved in that particular smile reserved for those she considered beneath her notice. Lyra kept her head down, her hands never pausing in their careful work as she polished the crystal barrier that surrounded the ancient relic at the heart of the chamber. The crystal of echoes sat silent and dark behind its protective shell, as it had for 3 centuries, offering no defense for its guardian against the daily humiliation that came with tending something everyone knew to be powerless. That had always been enough. The knowledge that she was fulfilling her family's sacred duty, even if no one else understood its importance. The morning light filtered through the narrow windows carved high in the stone walls, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the relic, like desperate fingers. Lyra moved through her ritual with practiced precision, cleaning each surface with the blessed oils her grandmother had taught her to prepare, speaking the ancient words under her breath that were supposed to maintain the bindings, words that felt more like prayers to deaf gods with each passing year. She heard the rustle of expensive silk as High Priestess Mira entered the chamber fully, her presence filling the space with that particular energy that came from someone who had never doubted their place in the world. Everything about her radiated authority and divine favor, from her pristine white robes to the golden circlet that marked her as the goddess's chosen vessel. She was everything Lyra would never be. Something is wrong. Something is very wrong. The thought struck her with sudden intensity, though she could not have said why. The relic appeared exactly as it always did, a sphere of what looked like crystallized moonlight about the size of her head, suspended within its protective barrier of ancient magic. But her wolf was pacing restlessly beneath her skin, a sensation that had become increasingly common over the past few weeks. The beast inside her that she could never quite reach, never quite set free, no matter how desperately she tried to shift. "You know why you cannot change, girl?" High Priestess Mira's voice echoed in her memory from a conversation years ago. "The goddess marks those who are meant to serve in ways that require sacrifice. Your wolf sleeps because it must." Lyra had accepted that explanation because she had no choice, just as she had accepted her position in the lowest chamber of the temple, tending a relic that had not shown even a flicker of power since before her great-great-grandmother's time. The crystal of echoes was beautiful but dead, and she was its appropriately powerless guardian. Today, something feels different about this place. She paused in her polishing, her cloth-wrapped hand hovering over the barrier's surface. For just a moment she could have sworn she felt something pulse beneath her palm, like a heartbeat made of starlight. But when she focused on the sensation, it faded, leaving her wondering if she had imagined it entirely. The sound of rapid footsteps in the corridor above made both women look toward the chamber entrance. A young acolyte appeared, her face flushed with excitement and fear in equal measure. "High Priestess, forgive the intrusion, but urgent news from the capital. The Alpha King's delegation has been sighted on the northern road. They will arrive before midday for the convergence ceremony." The words hit Lyra like a physical blow. The convergence ceremony happened only once every 7 years, when the most powerful supernatural leaders gathered to renew the ancient pacts that kept their world in balance. She had known it was coming, had heard the preparations being made throughout the temple complex, but the reality of it arriving felt sudden and terrifying. More terrifying still was the knowledge that the Alpha King himself would be walking these halls, inspecting every aspect of the temple's sacred duty, including her. High Priestess Mira's expression shifted to one of barely controlled panic. "Ensure all ceremonial items are prepared and positioned correctly. The delegation must find nothing out of place, nothing that would bring shame to this temple or question our dedication to the ancient ways." Her gaze fell on Lyra with unmistakable meaning, the relic guardian who could not shift, who tended an artifact that served no apparent purpose, who represented everything weak and useless about the old bloodlines. Lyra felt the familiar weight of expectations she could never meet settling over her shoulders like a mantle made of lead. "I understand, High Priestess. The relic chamber will be beyond reproach. It had better be. Because if the Alpha King questions the necessity of maintaining this charade, if he decides that resources would be better spent elsewhere, then your family's 12 generations of service will come to an end, and you will have no one to blame but yourself." The threat hung in the air long after High Priestess Mira swept from the chamber, leaving Lyra alone with the silent relic and the growing certainty that her world was about to shatter in ways she could not begin to imagine. She pressed her palm against the barrier again, searching for that phantom pulse she thought she had felt. This time there was nothing but smooth crystal and the endless quiet of a power that had been sleeping for so long that everyone had forgotten what it felt like when it was awake. But deep in her chest, her wolf stirred restlessly, and for the first time in years, Lyra wondered what would happen if something finally woke it up. The challenge came at dawn, delivered with all the formal ceremony that supernatural law demanded, and wrapped in the ancient words that made refusal impossible. Lyra stood on the temple's highest balcony, watching the sun rise over a world that had been forever changed by the events of the previous night. The ceremonial hall lay in ruins below, its ancient stones cracked by the force of divine power unleashed, but already she could see workers moving through the debris with the careful reverence due to a sacred space that had witnessed the awakening of legend. The supernatural dignitaries who had survived the Shadow Queen's assault had spent the remaining hours before dawn in heated debate, their voices carrying through the temple walls as they struggled to comprehend the implications of what they had witnessed. The Moon Daughter had awakened. The old laws had been shattered and rewritten. The political order that had maintained stability for centuries lay in ruins around them. And now they wanted proof that she was worthy of the power she claimed, Your Majesty. High Priestess Mira's voice carried a note of uncertainty that Lyra had never heard before, as if the woman who had spent her life serving the goddess's will was no longer certain what that service meant. "The Council of Elders has reached their decision regarding your transformation." Lyra turned from the sunrise to face the woman who had spent years dismissing her as worthless, and felt a flicker of grim amusement at the way High Priestess Mira now struggled to meet her eyes. Power changed everything, even the way people saw her face. What decision is that? They acknowledge your bloodline and accept the authenticity of your awakening, but they require proof of your worthiness to claim the title of Moon Daughter. The ancient laws demand trial by combat under the full moon, your power tested against a champion chosen by those who question your right to reshape supernatural law. The words hit her like ice water because she understood exactly what they meant. The council was not questioning whether she was truly the goddess's heir. The divine power that blazed through her transformed form made that impossible to deny. They were questioning whether she deserved to wield that power, whether she had the strength and wisdom to use it responsibly, and the only way to prove worthiness in their eyes was through violence. Who is the champion? Though she suspected she already knew the answer. Lady Seraphina has named a proxy to fight in her place, since her own departure makes personal combat impossible. The creature she chose is one of her most powerful servants, a being that has been enhanced by the same corruption that created her shadow army. Of course, even in defeat, even in exile, the Shadow Queen had found a way to threaten everything Lyra was trying to build. The trial by combat would not just be a test of her abilities, it would be a final attempt to destroy her before she could fully claim her heritage. But before she could respond to High Priestess Mira's words, golden fire blazed across the balcony as the Alpha King appeared with the fluid grace of a predator in motion. His amber eyes were fierce with protective fury, and when he spoke, his voice carried the absolute authority of someone who would not be denied. There will be no trial. If anyone wishes to challenge the Moon Daughter's claim, they can face me first. The declaration sent a thrill through Lyra's chest, because she could feel the mate bond that connected them blazing with his determination to protect her. But she also understood what he was offering, and the political catastrophe it would create if she accepted. "Your Majesty," High Priestess Mira said carefully, her voice tight with the kind of diplomatic tension that spoke of walking through a minefield. "The challenge cannot be refused or transferred. Supernatural law is clear on this matter. The Moon Daughter must prove herself through personal combat or forfeit her claim to divine authority. Then I will fight." Lyra's voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had already weighed all possibilities and chosen the path that led forward rather than backward. "But I will fight as myself, not as someone who needs protection from the consequences of claiming her birthright." The Alpha King's jaw tightened with frustration, but she could see in his amber eyes that he understood her reasoning. She could not rule the supernatural world from behind his protective strength. If she was to be the Moon Daughter in truth rather than just in name, she had to prove that the power burning in her veins came with the wisdom and courage to use it responsibly, even if the proof might kill her. The arena chosen for the trial was the sacred grove that bordered the eastern edge of the temple grounds, its ancient trees forming a natural amphitheatre that had witnessed supernatural combat for over 1,000 years. By the time the full moon reached its zenith, hundreds of supernatural beings had gathered to watch the Moon Daughter face her first true test. Lyra stood in the centre of the grove, silver light streaming from her transformed form as she waited for her opponent to reveal itself. She had spent the day learning to control abilities that had been awakening since the Crystal of Echoes shattered, testing the limits of power that felt vast enough to reshape reality if she let it run unchecked. But controlling divine magic was like trying to hold starfire in her bare hands. It wanted to burn, wanted to consume, wanted to pour out of her in cascades of silver flame that would purify everything they touched. The corrupted Moon Daughter's final warning echoed in her memory with growing urgency. The goddess's power was not just a gift, it was a force that could devour everything she was trying to protect. Then the shadows at the edge of the grove began to move, and her opponent stepped into the moonlight with the fluid grace of something that had never been entirely human. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, its form shifting between solid flesh and liquid darkness, with claws that gleamed like obsidian and eyes that reflected the void between stars. The corruption that Lady Seraphina had used to create her shadow army was concentrated here, refined and perfected into something that could challenge even divine power through sheer malevolent will. But more horrifying than its inhuman appearance was the way it moved, the casual predatory confidence of something that had never known defeat. This was not just a champion chosen to test her abilities. This was an assassin sent to ensure that the Moon Daughter's awakening would be brief and final. The creature spoke with a voice like grinding stone and whispered promises of violence. "You are young in your power, goddess child, young and untested, and already burning yourself from within. I need only wait for your own strength to consume you, then feast on whatever remains." It was right, and they both knew it. The divine magic that blazed through Lyra's transformed form was still too new, too wild, too eager to pour out of her in ways that would leave her drained and vulnerable. She had power enough to level mountains, but she lacked the experience to wield it efficiently. But as the corrupted champion began to circle her with predatory patience, as she felt the weight of hundreds of supernatural gazes judging her worthiness to reshape their world, something shifted in her understanding of what the Moon Daughter was truly meant to be. She was not meant to burn herself out in displays of raw power. She was meant to be the bridge between mortal limitation and divine possibility, the being who could touch the goddess's strength without being consumed by it. The creature attacked with inhuman speed, its obsidian claws reaching for her throat with killing intent. But instead of meeting its assault with silver fire, instead of trying to overpower it through sheer magical force, Lyra did something that her opponent had not expected. She became moonlight, not shape-shifting in the way of her werewolf heritage, but something far more profound. She let her consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of flesh and bone, becoming one with the lunar radiance that streamed down from the full moon above. The creature's claws passed through empty air as she flowed around its attack like water around stone. Then she reformed behind it, her hand touching its shadowy flesh with gentle precision. The purification began immediately, divine light pouring into the corruption that animated the creature's form. But instead of burning away the darkness with violent force, she sought the soul that lay trapped beneath layers of magical perversion. A werewolf alpha, she realized with growing sadness. Someone who had been powerful enough to be considered a threat, captured and twisted into an instrument of the Shadow Queen's will until he had forgotten everything he had once been. The creature screamed as her light found the divine spark that existed within every supernatural soul, as centuries of corruption began to burn away to reveal the person who lay beneath. It fought against the purification with desperate violence, its claws seeking her flesh even as its shadowy form began to dissolve. But Lyra held on, pouring her power into the healing with steady determination, despite the agony that the corrupted magic caused her transformed flesh. This was what the Moon Daughter was meant to do, not destroy the darkness, but transform it back into light. When the purification was complete, a man knelt where the creature had stood, an alpha werewolf with silver hair and golden eyes, weeping with the overwhelming relief of someone who had been trapped in a nightmare for so long that he had forgotten what freedom felt like. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice hoarse with centuries of suppressed anguish. "Forgive what I was made to do. You have nothing to be forgiven for." Lyra's voice carried infinite compassion for the tragedy of what he had endured. "You were a victim, not a villain, and now you are free." The assembled supernatural dignitaries stared in stunned silence as they witnessed what true divine power looked like when wielded with wisdom instead of wrath. She had not defeated her opponent through superior strength. She had transformed him from enemy to ally through the application of healing magic that sought restoration rather than destruction. This was the Moon Daughter's gift to the world, not the power to remake it through force, but the ability to heal the wounds that darkness had carved into supernatural society over centuries of careful corruption. The Alpha King moved to stand beside her in the centre of the grove, his golden fire blazing in harmony with her silver radiance, as the mate bond that connected them pulsed with shared triumph. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the amphitheatre with the absolute authority of someone proclaiming truth that could not be denied. "Behold the Moon Daughter, heir to the goddess's own power, proven worthy through compassion rather than conquest. She is my mate, my chosen queen, and anyone who questions her right to reshape our world will answer to both of us." The assembled crowd dropped to their knees as one, supernatural nobles and common folk alike, acknowledging the divine authority that blazed between the two figures standing in the moonlight. The trial was over, the challenge met and answered, the Moon Daughter's claim validated through the application of power that served healing rather than harm. But as Lyra looked out over the sea of kneeling figures, as she felt the weight of their expectations and the magnitude of the responsibility she had claimed, she began to understand that proving her worthiness was only the beginning. Now she had to build something new from the ruins of the old world, something worthy of the power that burned in her veins and the trust that her people were placing in her transformed hands. 3 months had passed since the night the world changed, and Lyra stood in the place where the crystal of echoes had once sung its ancient song, watching silver light fountain from the sacred spring that had taken its place. The transformation of the temple had been gradual, but profound, stone and spellwork reshaping themselves around the moon, daughter's presence, until the building itself seemed to breathe with divine purpose. Where the relic chamber had once held a single artifact in protective isolation, now an eternal spring of lunar magic flowed upward like liquid starlight, its radiance visible from every corner of the temple complex. But more than the physical changes, it was the shift in the people around her that marked how completely their world had been reborn. The same supernatural dignitaries who had once dismissed her as a powerless temple servant now sought her counsel on matters of law and policy, their ancient prejudices swept away by the undeniable reality of her divine authority. Your Majesty. The title still felt strange coming from High Priestess Mira's lips, delivered with the kind of respectful deference that Lyra had never expected to receive from the woman who had spent years reminding her of her worthlessness. The Northern Territories have sent word that their purification efforts are proceeding ahead of schedule. 3 more Shadow Touch settlements have been cleansed, and their populations are integrating successfully with the restored communities. Lyra nodded, her attention still focused on the fountain of silver light that had replaced the crystal she had spent her life guarding. The corruption that Lady Seraphina had spread throughout the supernatural world had run deeper than anyone had initially understood. Shadow-touch creatures and polluted territories requiring careful application of lunar magic to restore them to their natural state. It was work that could have taken decades, but the Moon Daughter's awakened power made the impossible merely difficult. Each pulse of divine radiance from the sacred spring carried purifying energy to every corner of their realm, slowly but steadily burning away the darkness that had infected their people for generations. And what of the Western kingdoms? The diplomatic reports that crossed her desk daily told a story of supernatural society rebuilding itself around new principles, old hierarchies dissolving as the Moon Daughter's influence spread throughout their interconnected realms. King Marcus has formally acknowledged your authority and requested permission to send a delegation for the Harvest Festival. High Priestess Mira's voice carried a note of satisfaction that spoke of political victories achieved through negotiation rather than force. The vampire courts have agreed to the new feeding restrictions, and the Fey nobility have accepted the revised territorial agreements without significant protest. Progress, but progress that came with its own dangers. The supernatural world was adapting to the reality of having a divine ruler, but adaptation was not the same as acceptance. There were still factions that viewed her awakening as a threat to the natural order, still voices that whispered about the dangers of concentrating so much power in the hands of someone so young and untested. But those whispers had grown quieter over the months, partly because of her demonstrated wisdom in wielding divine authority, and partly because of the golden fire that blazed beside her silver radiance whenever challenges to her rule emerged. Speaking of which, High Priestess Mira's tone shifted to something that might have been amusement, though she tried to hide it behind formal composure. His Majesty has been asking when you might be free to discuss the final preparations for tomorrow's ceremony. Lyra felt warmth spread through her chest at the mention of the Alpha King, the mate bond that connected them pulsing with shared anticipation for what the next day would bring. Their formal bonding ceremony had been delayed by the practical necessities of rebuilding a shattered world, but now that stability had been achieved, nothing would keep them apart any longer. Tell him I will join him in the Eastern Garden once I finish reviewing these territorial agreements. But as High Priestess Mira departed with a respectful bow, Lyra found her attention drawn not to the diplomatic papers that required her approval, but to her own reflection in the fountain's silver surface. She looked older than her 23 years, marked by the weight of responsibility and the constant presence of divine power that flowed through her transformed form. Her hair still held the liquid silver quality that had emerged during her awakening, her eyes still blazed with moonfire, and her skin still carried the faint luminescence that spoke of goddess-touched heritage. But beneath the supernatural changes, she could still see traces of the frightened temple servant who had spent her life believing she was nothing. the woman who had accepted cruelty as normal, who had hidden in shadows and convinced herself that invisibility was safety. That woman was gone now, transformed as completely as the crystal she had once guarded. But sometimes, in quiet moments like this, Lyra wondered if the sacrifice had been worth the power she had gained. The sound of familiar footsteps on stone interrupted her introspection, and she turned to find the Alpha King approaching with that fluid, predatory grace that still made her pulse quicken after all these months. He moved differently now, she had noticed, with the relaxed confidence of someone who no longer had to choose between duty and desire. The territorial agreements can wait. His voice carried the warm authority that she had learned to associate with private moments when the crown and the goddess could set aside their responsibilities in favour of simpler truths. There are more important matters that require our attention, such as... Though she could feel through their bond exactly what matters he was referring to, could sense the way his golden fire reached toward her silver radiance, with the inevitable pull of celestial bodies locked in eternal orbit. Such is the fact that tomorrow evening you will finally be my wife in truth as well as in supernatural lore, and I have been patient long enough. He moved closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his powerful frame, could smell the masculine scent that made her wolf purr with satisfaction deep in her chest. When he reached for her, she went to him willingly, letting herself be pulled against his chest with the kind of surrender that she had never thought she would be capable of offering. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly, his lips brushing against her temple in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. Ready to bind yourself to an Alpha King who comes with kingdoms to rule and enemies to face and a future that will never be simple or safe. The question carried weight beyond the obvious, because they both understood what tomorrow's ceremony would mean. Not just the formal bonding between mates, but the union of divine and royal authority that would create something entirely new in the supernatural world. The Moon Daughter and the Alpha King, ruling together from a position of shared power that had never existed before in recorded history. "I have been ready since the night you walked into my chamber and saw something worth protecting in a worthless temple servant," she said against his shoulder, her voice carrying all the fierce certainty that had been building in her chest for months. "The question is whether you are ready to be bound to someone whose power still frightens her sometimes." His grip tightened, his protective instincts responding to the vulnerability she had allowed into her voice. Because despite all the changes, despite the divine authority and the political victories and the supernatural world kneeling at her feet, there were still moments when the magnitude of what she had become felt overwhelming. "I have been ready since the moment I realized that the Crystal of Echoes was calling to you, not to me." His voice was rough with emotion that made their bond blaze brighter. "Since the moment I understood that everything I thought I knew about destiny and political necessity was about to be proven catastrophically wrong." They stood together beside the fountain of silver light, two beings who had been shaped by forces beyond their control into something that their world had never seen before. Tomorrow would bring ceremony and celebration, formal vows and public declarations, but tonight was theirs alone. And in the sacred silence of the chamber where everything had begun, where a frightened guardian had first felt the pulse of awakening power, Lyra finally understood what the Moon Daughter's true purpose had always been. Not to rule through fear or to reshape the world through force, but to heal the ancient wounds that had divided their people and create space for love to flourish in places where only duty had existed before. The fountain sang with liquid music that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself, and in its ethereal harmonies she heard the promise of a future that no prophecy had ever predicted, no political marriage had ever been designed to achieve, a future built on the foundation of impossible love, finally given the freedom to grow into something worthy of the power that protected it. The eternal fountain sang with liquid starlight, its silver radiance painting the sacred chamber in hues that had never existed before the Moon Daughter awakened to claim her birthright. Lyra stood where the crystal of echoes had once held court in protective isolation, her transformed form reflecting in the mirror-smooth surface of the spring that now poured upward like gravity-defying moonbeams. 6 months had passed since her bonding ceremony with the Alpha King, 6 months of learning what it meant to rule not just with divine authority, but with the kind of love that transformed political necessity into genuine partnership. The chamber itself had become something entirely new, its ancient stones reshaped by supernatural forces into a shrine that honoured both the past and the future. Where protective barriers had once separated the relic from the world, now the eternal spring flowed freely, its purifying magic accessible to anyone who sought healing from the corruption that had once plagued their realm. But it was not the physical transformation that marked how completely their world had changed. It was the way she felt standing here, no longer the frightened guardian who had spent her life believing she was nothing, but the Moon Daughter who had learned to carry divine power with the wisdom that came from understanding what it meant to be truly loved. The sound of familiar footsteps on stone made her turn, and she smiled as the Alpha King appeared in the doorway with that fluid, predatory grace that still made her pulse quicken despite all the months they had shared. He moved differently now, she had noticed, with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never again been forced to choose between duty and the desires of his heart, still communing with the source of your power. His voice carried the warm teasing that she had learned to associate with private moments when the crown and the goddess could set aside their responsibilities in favour of simpler truths. Still marvelling that it exists at all. She gestured toward the fountain of silver light that had replaced the crystal she had spent her life protecting. Sometimes I look at this place and remember what it was like when I believed I was nothing but a keeper of dust and broken dreams. He crossed the chamber to stand beside her, his golden fire reaching toward her silver radiance with the inevitable pull of celestial bodies locked in eternal orbit. Their bond had only grown stronger over the months of shared rule, mate recognition deepening into something that felt like two souls learning to breathe with the same rhythm. And now, his hand found hers, fingers intertwining with the casual intimacy of people who had stopped questioning whether they deserved the happiness they had found. Now I understand what the Moon Daughter was always meant to be, not a ruler who commanded through fear, but a healer who created space for love to flourish where only duty had existed before. The truth of it settled around them like a benediction, because their reign had been marked not by conquest or political manoeuvring, but by the patient work of restoration. Territory by territory, community by community, they had cleansed the corruption that Lady Seraphina had spread throughout the supernatural world, replacing shadow-touched despair with the kind of hope that came from knowing that healing was always possible. There was something I wanted to tell you. Her voice carried a note of barely contained excitement that made his amber eyes sharpen with sudden attention. Something I discovered this morning during my meditation with the spring. The fountain pulsed brighter, as if responding to the shift in her emotional state, and in its silver radiance she could see the reflection of truths that would reshape their future in ways they had never dared to dream. I am carrying our child. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge made of starlight, loaded with implications that reached far beyond the personal joy of expectant parents. Because this child would be something that had never existed before in their world, the heir to both divine and royal bloodlines, born from the union of Moon Daughter and Alpha King. The Alpha King went very still, his golden fire flaring brighter as he processed what she had just told him. When he spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion that made their bond blaze, like a star being born. "Are you certain? As certain as I am that the goddess chose us for each other?" She could feel the new life growing within her, a presence that already pulsed with both silver radiance and golden flame. The next Moon Daughter, or perhaps the first Moon Son, carrying the combined heritage of two bloodlines that had been shaped by destiny into something entirely unprecedented. He pulled her against his chest with careful reverence, his strong arms wrapping around her as if she were made of the most precious crystal in existence. Against her ear she could hear his heart racing with the kind of overwhelming joy that came from discovering that everything you thought you wanted was only the beginning of what the universe had planned to give you. I love you. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of transformation, of two people who had been broken by duty and politics and the cruel expectations of a world that had never seen their worth until they claimed it for themselves. I love you too. And for the first time in her life, Lyra understood what it meant to say those words without fear, without the shadow of unworthiness poisoning their meaning. They stood together beside the eternal fountain, two beings who had been shaped by forces beyond their control into something their world had never seen before. The Moon Daughter and the Alpha King, bound by love that had proven stronger than political necessity, now preparing to bring new life into a realm they had transformed through the patient application of healing rather than conquest. The silver light poured upward around them like liquid music, and in its ethereal harmonies Lyra heard the echo of everything she had once been and everything she had become. The frightened temple servant who had accepted cruelty as normal, the hidden guardian of a powerless relic, the awakened goddess heir who had learned to wield divine authority with the wisdom that came from understanding what it meant to be truly cherished. But more than any of those identities, she was simply herself, Lyra, the woman who had discovered that breaking what you thought was meant to protect you could sometimes be the only way to find what you were truly meant to become. The fountain sang with voices that seemed to come from the depths of eternity itself, ancient harmonies that spoke of cycles ending and beginning, of power passing from one generation to the next, of love creating space for miracles that no prophecy had ever predicted. And in the sacred chamber where everything had begun, where a frightened guardian had first felt the pulse of awakening power, the Moon Daughter finally understood what her transformation had always been meant to achieve. Not the shattering of the old world, but the creation of space for new possibilities to take root and flourish. Not the destruction of what came before, but the healing of ancient wounds that had kept their people separated by fear and prejudice, and the bitter legacy of choices made by those who had forgotten what love could accomplish when it was given the freedom to grow. She had spent her life believing she was nothing but a keeper of dust and broken dreams. But in learning to love and be loved in return, she had discovered that sometimes the most powerful magic in any realm was simply the courage to break what no longer served the cause of joy and build something beautiful from the pieces. The world shifted when he entered the temple grounds. Lyra felt it before she saw him, a tremor that ran through the stone foundations and up into her bones like the approach of an earthquake. She was in the relic chamber, having spent the morning ensuring every surface gleamed with desperate perfection, when the sensation hit her so hard she had to grip the crystal barrier to keep from falling to her knees. Power. Raw, overwhelming, ancient power that made her wolf throw itself against the cage of her ribs with sudden violence. Above her she could hear the controlled chaos of an important arrival. Footsteps that spoke of authority, voices pitched low with respect and fear, the subtle sounds of an entire temple holding its breath. The Alpha King had arrived, and even 3 levels below the main hall, Lyra could feel his presence like pressure in the air before a storm. She pressed herself against the far wall of the chamber, making herself as small and invisible as possible. The inspection would come eventually, but perhaps if she stayed very quiet and very still, it would pass over her like all unpleasant things eventually did. Perhaps the Alpha King would glance at the relic, dismiss it as the curiosity everyone knew it to be, and move on to more important matters. The crystal of echoes pulsed, just once, so faintly she might have imagined it, but unmistakable in the silence of her sanctuary. a flicker of silver light that lasted no longer than a heartbeat, gone before she could be certain she had truly seen it. Then she felt it. Something was very wrong. Something was very wrong, because someone was coming down the stairs to her chamber, and those footsteps were too heavy, too confident, too dangerous to belong to anyone she wanted to face. The Alpha King appeared in her doorway like a force of nature given human form. He was nothing like what she had expected, and everything her worst fears had conjured. Tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the stone archway, broad enough that his shoulders nearly filled the space, with the kind of presence that made the air itself seem to bend around him. His hair was dark as midnight, his eyes the deep gold of ancient amber, and when his gaze swept the chamber and found her cowering in the shadows, Lyra felt something in her chest crack open like an egg. Mate. The word echoed in her head, and she did not know if it came from her wolf or from some ancient instinct she had never felt before. It hit her with the force of revelation and the terror of impossibility, because this was the Alpha King, and she was nothing, and the universe did not make mistakes this cruel. He stepped into the chamber with the fluid grace of a predator, his attention immediately drawn to the crystal of echoes. As he moved closer to the relic, Lyra's wolf went completely insane, clawing and howling inside her chest with such desperation that she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. Fascinating. His voice was exactly what she had expected, and nothing like what she had prepared for, deep and rich with the kind of authority that could command armies or whisper secrets. What is this artifact exactly? Lyra realized with growing horror that he was speaking to her, not to High Priestess Mira, who would surely appear at any moment to handle such important questions. To her, the worthless guardian who was supposed to remain invisible. The crystal of echoes, Your Majesty. She heard her own voice, as if from a great distance, thin and uncertain in the presence of his overwhelming reality. It has been in my family's care for 12 generations, and what does it do? The question was simple, direct, and utterly impossible to answer truthfully, because the truth was that no one knew what it did, only what it was supposed to do according to ancient texts that might as well have been fairy stories. The truth was that it had been powerless for centuries, a beautiful reminder of glory days that had passed beyond memory. But as the Alpha King moved closer to the crystal barrier, something extraordinary began to happen. The relic began to glow. Not the faint pulse she thought she might have imagined earlier, but a steady, growing radiance that filled the chamber with silver light. The Alpha King stopped moving, his golden eyes fixed on the artifact with an intensity that made Lyra's skin burn. Impossible, he breathed, and she heard wonder and something that might have been fear threading through his voice. The light grew stronger, and with it came a sound like distant singing, harmonies that seemed to come from the crystal itself. Lyra had never heard anything like it, had never read about anything like it in all the ancient texts she had studied. The crystal of echoes was responding to his presence with power that defied 3 centuries of silence. Then the Alpha King did something that stopped her heart entirely. He reached toward the barrier, his hand moving slowly but with unmistakable intention. No. The word tore from her throat before she could stop it, driven by an instinct deeper than fear. Please, Your Majesty, the barrier cannot be disturbed. The ancient texts forbid direct contact with the relic. He turned to look at her then, really look at her, and Lyra felt herself drowning in the amber depths of his gaze. There was intelligence there, and curiosity, and something else that made her wolf keen with desperate longing. And what happens if it is disturbed? She opened her mouth to recite the warnings she had memorized from childhood, the dire predictions about catastrophic power released and the careful balance of the world overturned. But under his direct attention, with the crystal of echoes singing its impossible song behind him, the words felt hollow and meaningless. I do not know, Your Majesty. I only know that my family has guarded against that possibility for 300 years. Something shifted in his expression. a recognition that she could not name but felt like lightning in her veins. He took a step toward her, no longer focused on the relic but on her face, her eyes, the way she was trembling against the stone wall. "What is your name?" "Lyra, your Majesty." Lyra. He said it like he was testing the taste of it, like it meant something more than just the collection of sounds that had followed her through a lifetime of insignificance. Behind him, the crystal's light pulsed in rhythm with her thundering heartbeat. And then High Priestess Mira's voice cut through the impossible moment like a blade. "Your Majesty, I do hope our humble guardian has not been presuming to waste your valuable time with her meaningless duties." The spell shattered. The Alpha King turned toward the doorway where High Priestess Mira stood in her pristine robes, and the crystal's light began to fade back toward its normal silence. But not entirely. Even as Lyra watched, she could see threads of silver still moving within its depths, restless and alive in ways that defied everything she thought she knew about the relic she had spent her life protecting. "Not meaningless," the Alpha King said quietly, his gaze moving once more between Lyra and the Crystal of Echoes. "I think there might be far more here than anyone realizes." He left the chamber with High Priestess Mira, their voices fading as they climbed toward the upper levels of the temple. But the air still hummed with the memory of his presence, and deep in her chest, Lyra's wolf paced with newfound restlessness. Everything changed when he entered the temple grounds, and she was beginning to understand that nothing would ever be the same. "Your Majesty must understand that the Crystal of Echoes is not a relic to be taken lightly." High Priestess Mira's voice carried the weight of centuries as she led the Alpha King through the upper chambers of the temple, but Lyra could hear the tension threading beneath her formal words. She had remained in the relic chamber after their departure, ostensibly to complete her daily duties, but truly because her legs had refused to carry her anywhere else. The encounter with the Alpha King had left her shaking with something that felt like fever, her wolf still pacing restlessly beneath her skin. She pressed her ear to the stone wall, following their voices as they moved through the sacred spaces above. The ancient construction carried sound in strange ways, and she had learned over the years which walls would whisper the secrets of the upper temple to those who knew how to listen. The texts speak of a power that could reshape the very foundations of our world, High Priestess Mira continued, and Lyra heard the rustle of parchment being unfolded. They call it the lost power of the moon goddess, sealed away when the ancient bloodlines fell to corruption and war, and yet it has shown no sign of that power for 3 centuries until today. The Alpha King's voice was thoughtful, measured, but underneath it Lyra heard something that made her chest tighten with inexplicable dread. "Tell me about the Guardian's bloodline." The words struck her like a physical blow. No one ever asked about her bloodline, because everyone assumed there was nothing worth knowing. She was the descendant of temple servants, keepers of a powerless relic, so far beneath notice that her family tree had never been considered relevant to anything. But High Priestess Mira's response carried a weight that made Lyra's breath catch in her throat. "Ancient beyond measure, Your Majesty." The Guardian bloodline stretches back to the time of the moon goddess herself, an unbroken chain of daughters chosen to tend the crystal's power. They say the first Guardian was blessed by the goddess personally, marked with the ability to contain and channel lunar magic. Lyra sank to the floor, her back pressed against the cool stone as the implications crashed over her. Ancient bloodline, moon goddess blessing, the ability to contain and channel power that she had never felt, never accessed, never even suspected she might possess. "And the current Guardian shows no signs of this heritage," the Alpha King observed, but there was something in his tone that suggested the statement was actually a question. "None whatsoever." "The girl cannot even shift, Your Majesty. Her wolf sleeps so deeply it might as well be dead. We have long assumed that the bloodline has finally been diluted beyond usefulness, that whatever power once ran through her family has faded to nothing." Lyra wrapped her arms around her knees, feeling smaller and more worthless than ever. Of course that was what they thought. Of course that was what she had been told her entire life. The broken guardian of a broken relic, the last pathetic echo of something that had once been mighty. But then she heard footsteps on the stairs leading down toward her chamber, and her heart began to race with the knowledge that the Alpha King was returning. This time he was alone, his powerful presence undiluted by the High Priestess's hovering attention. He appeared in her doorway like a storm given human form, and the crystal of echoes immediately began to pulse with that impossible silver light. But this time Lyra felt something she had never experienced before, a resonance deep in her bones, as if the relic's song was finding an echo in her blood that had been waiting her entire life to be awakened. "The bloodline is not diluted," he said quietly, his golden eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. "It is suppressed." The words hit her like lightning, illuminating truths she had never dared to consider. Suppressed, not absent, not diluted, hidden, contained, held down by forces she could not yet understand. "Why would it be suppressed?" she whispered, because she could not make her voice any stronger in the face of such a revelation. Because someone was afraid of what you might become if you ever learned what you truly are. He moved closer to the crystal barrier, and this time when the relic responded with cascading light, Lyra felt the power calling to something deep inside her chest. Her wolf stirred, not with the restless pacing she had grown accustomed to, but with sudden, violent awareness. For just a moment she could feel the shape of what had been locked away inside her, vast and ancient and terrifyingly beautiful. Then the sensation faded, leaving her gasping and more confused than ever. The Alpha King studied her with those amber eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed invisibility. "Your family has guarded this relic for 12 generations, but I suspect they were never meant to be merely guards. They were meant to be vessels. Vessels for what? For the power that someone decided was too dangerous to be left free in the world." He gestured toward the crystal of echoes, which continued to sing its ethereal song in response to his presence. But power like this cannot be contained forever. Eventually, it finds a way to reclaim what belongs to it. Lyra felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of bonds she had never known existed. But before she could explore the sensation, voices echoed from the corridor above, multiple voices, including one she recognized with a chill of foreboding. "Your Majesty, I have been searching everywhere for you." Lady Seraphina's voice was like honey poured over steel, beautiful and deadly. "The delegation grows restless, and there are matters of state that require your attention." The Alpha King's expression closed off immediately, the moment of revelation shattered by the intrusion of political reality. Lady Seraphina appeared in the doorway, resplendent in silk robes the colour of fresh blood, her perfect features arranged in an expression of gentle concern that did not reach her cold blue eyes. "Surely you have not been wasting time in the lower chambers," she continued, her gaze flicking over Lyra with the kind of dismissive assessment reserved for furniture or livestock. "There are far more pressing concerns awaiting your decision." "Indeed." The Alpha King's voice had returned to the formal cadences of royal authority, all traces of the intimate revelation wiped away. But his eyes found Lyra's one more time, and in that brief contact she saw a promise that made her heart stutter with dangerous hope. He left with Lady Seraphina, their voices fading as they climbed toward the temple's political heart. But the crystal of echoes continued to glow with soft silver radiance, and for the first time in her life Lyra could feel something stirring in the depths of her soul that felt like power waiting to be claimed. The convergence ceremony was tomorrow, and she had the growing certainty that everything she thought she knew about herself, about her purpose, about the relic she had spent her life protecting, was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Her wolf lifted its head in the cage of her ribs and howled with a voice she had never heard before, wild and ancient and full of recognition. Whatever was coming, whatever truth had been hidden in her bloodline for generations, it was finally ready to break free. And she was terrified that when it did, the careful order of her world would shatter like glass. The night came alive with silver fire when he found her alone. Lyra had not intended to return to the relic chamber after the evening prayers, but sleep eluded her with vicious determination. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw golden amber gazing into her soul, heard that deep voice speaking impossible words about suppressed bloodlines and hidden power. Her wolf had been restless all day, pacing and whining with an urgency that made her skin feel too tight for her bones. So she had slipped through the darkened corridors of the temple, using passages she had learned as a child to avoid the night guards and their uncomfortable questions. The relic chamber welcomed her like an old friend, its familiar shadows offering the only sanctuary she had ever known. But the Crystal of Echoes was different in the darkness. Where it had always been merely beautiful before, a sphere of crystallized moonlight that caught and reflected whatever illumination reached it, now it seemed to generate its own radiance. Soft silver light pulsed within its depths like a slow heartbeat, and with each pulse Lyra felt an answering throb in her chest that was both exhilarating and terrifying. She pressed her palm against the crystal barrier, searching for the connection she had felt during the Alpha King's visit. The surface was warm beneath her touch, humming with an energy that made her nerve endings sing with recognition. "I wondered if I would find you here." His voice emerged from the shadows like velvet wrapped around steel, and Lyra spun around so quickly she nearly lost her balance. The Alpha King stood in the doorway, no longer dressed in the formal regalia of his station, but in simple dark clothing that somehow made him seem even more dangerous. Without the trappings of royalty to distance him, he was just a man of impossible presence and predatory grace, a man who was looking at her like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his entire life. "Your Majesty," she breathed, dropping into a curtsy that felt awkward and insufficient. "I did not realize you would be visiting the chamber again tonight. I could not sleep." He stepped into the room, and immediately the Crystal of Echoes blazed brighter, its silver radiance filling the space between them with light that seemed almost alive. There was something about this place, about what happened here today, that I cannot stop thinking about. Lyra felt heat rise in her cheeks because she knew exactly what he meant. The moment when their eyes had met and the world had shifted on its axis. The impossible recognition that had passed between them like lightning seeking ground. "The relic has never responded to anyone before," she said quietly, because it was safer than acknowledging the other thing that had awakened in this chamber. The texts speak of its power, but in 3 centuries it has remained silent and dark. Until today. He moved closer, and with each step Lyra's wolf grew more agitated, clawing at the barriers that kept it locked away. But not just silent. I can feel it calling to something. Can you not sense it as well? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made her chest tight with equal parts hope and terror. Because she could sense it, had been sensing it since the moment he first entered her sanctuary. A pull that felt like gravity, like magnetism, like the inexorable force that drew the tide to the moon. "I feel something," she admitted, the words barely audible in the sacred silence of the chamber. "But I do not understand what it means." He was close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold in his amber eyes, could smell the masculine scent of him that made her wolf keen with desperate longing. When he spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion she could not name. "It means that everything they told us about duty and political necessity and the proper order of things is about to be proven wrong." The air between them crackled with tension that had nothing to do with the supernatural energy radiating from the crystal. This was something else entirely, something that made her skin burn and her heart race with a rhythm that matched the pulsing light surrounding them. "But you are promised to Lady Seraphina," Lyra whispered, because she had to say something to break the spell before it consumed them both. The marriage is necessary for the alliance between your kingdom and hers, is it?" His hand rose toward her face, stopping just short of touching her cheek. Or is that just what we have been told, because someone is afraid of what might happen if we chose differently? The question was loaded with dangerous possibility, and Lyra felt something crack open in her chest like an egg revealing the creature within. Her wolf surged against its constraints, and for just a moment she felt the shape of what had been hidden from her. Power. Ancient, vast, lunar power that sang in harmony with the crystal's ethereal song. Then pain lanced through her skull like a blade of ice, and she gasped, doubling over as agony ripped through every nerve. It felt like something was trying to tear itself free from inside her bones, like the very foundations of her being were under attack by forces she could not comprehend. The Alpha King caught her before she could fall, his strong arms pulling her against his chest as waves of supernatural anguish crashed over her. Through the haze of pain, she felt his power wrapping around her like a shield, his alpha dominance creating a barrier between her and whatever force was causing her distress. "What is happening to me?" she gasped against his shoulder, her fingers clutching at the fabric of his shirt as if he were the only solid thing in a world gone mad. "Your power is trying to break free." His voice was tight with controlled fury, and when she looked up at him, she saw his eyes blazing with golden fire. Someone has bound it so tightly that it is fighting itself to escape. But bonds like that are not natural. They were placed there deliberately. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Someone had done this to her. Someone had taken whatever heritage lay sleeping in her bloodline and locked it away so completely that she had never even suspected it existed. Someone had stolen her very identity and left her believing she was nothing but a failure. But who would do such a thing? And why? Because they were afraid of what you might become if you ever learned the truth. He held her closer as another wave of pain rolled through her, his presence somehow anchoring her to reality when everything else felt like it was dissolving. Because power like yours, power that can resonate with artifacts of the moon goddess herself, is the kind that reshapes the world. The crystal of echoes pulsed brighter, and with its light came a moment of perfect clarity. Lyra could feel the bonds that had constrained her power her entire life, could sense the careful magical construction that had kept her wolf sleeping and her heritage buried. But she could also feel cracks forming in those bonds, hairline fractures spreading through the supernatural prison that someone had built around her soul. And through those cracks, ancient power was beginning to bleed. The Alpha King must have sensed it too, because his grip tightened and his voice dropped to a growl that spoke of protective instincts older than civilization. They will not keep you caged forever. Whatever they have done to you, whatever they were trying to prevent, it is already beginning to unravel. But before she could respond, before she could explore the terrifying implications of his words, footsteps echoed in the corridor above. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with the purposeful stride of people who had been searching for something they had finally found. "Your Majesty." Lady Seraphina's voice cut through the magical atmosphere like a blade of Arctic ice. "The delegation has been concerned about your absence from the evening proceedings." The Alpha King released Lyra with obvious reluctance, stepping back to create the proper distance that protocol demanded. But his eyes remained locked on hers, and in their amber depths she saw a promise that made her chest tight with dangerous hope. Lady Seraphina appeared in the doorway like a vision of perfect beauty and barely contained fury. Her midnight hair was arranged in an elaborate style that spoke of hours of preparation, her silk gown the colour of fresh blood, her blue eyes sharp with the kind of intelligence that missed nothing and forgave even less. "Surely this humble guardian has not been monopolizing your attention with her trivial concerns," she said, her gaze flicking over Lyra with dismissive assessment. "There are matters of real importance awaiting your decision." "Nothing about tonight has been trivial." The Alpha King's voice carried a warning that made even Lady Seraphina's perfect composure falter slightly. "But you are correct that there are matters requiring attention. I shall return to the delegation immediately." He left with Lady Seraphina, but not before his eyes found Lyra's one more time. In that brief contact, she felt the echo of his touch, the promise of revelations yet to come, and the terrifying certainty that whatever was growing between them could not be contained by political necessity or social expectation. Alone in the relic chamber, Lyra sank to her knees before the crystal of echoes. The pain in her skull had faded to a manageable ache, but she could still feel the cracks spreading through the supernatural bonds that had constrained her power. With each breath, each heartbeat, each pulse of silver light from the ancient artifact, those cracks grew wider. Tomorrow was the convergence ceremony, and she had the growing certainty that by the time it ended, neither she nor the carefully ordered world around her would ever be the same. They came in the hour before dawn, when the temple lay wrapped in the sacred silence that preceded morning prayers. Lyra woke to the sound of her wolf howling inside her chest, a desperate warning that sent ice through her veins before her conscious mind could even process what had disturbed her sleep. She bolted upright in her small chamber, heart hammering, as supernatural instincts she had never fully trusted screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. The shadows were moving, not the natural play of darkness and moonlight that she had grown accustomed to during 23 years of temple life, but shapes that writhed with malevolent purpose. They poured through the narrow window like liquid night, coalescing into forms that hurt to look at directly, creatures of shadow and hunger that moved with the fluid grace of nightmares given substance, the crystal of echoes. The knowledge hit her like a physical blow, certainty that blazed through her consciousness with the force of divine revelation. They were here for the relic, drawn by the power that had been awakening over the past 2 days. The ancient artifact that had remained hidden and dormant for centuries was calling to things that should have stayed buried in the spaces between worlds. Lyra ran. She flew through the corridors of the temple in her nightgown and bare feet, terror lending her speed as the sound of destruction followed in her wake. Behind her, she could hear the shadow creatures tearing through stone and wood with casual violence, their alien voices raised in harmonies that made her bones ache with wrongness. But when she reached the relic chamber, she found something that stopped her heart entirely. They were already there, dozens of them, circling the crystal of echoes like predators around cornered prey. The ancient protective barrier that had guarded the artifact for centuries was flickering weakly, its golden light stuttering under the assault of forces it had never been designed to withstand. And the relic was screaming, not with sound, but with waves of psychic anguish that crashed over Lyra like physical blows. The crystal of echoes blazed with silver fire as it fought against the creatures trying to claim it, its song now a shriek of desperate resistance that made her wolf throw itself against the cage of her ribs with violent desperation. Without thinking, without planning, without any consideration for her own safety, Lyra stepped into the chamber. Get away from it. Her voice carried power she had never felt before, authority that seemed to rise from the deepest wells of her being and pour out through her words like liquid fire. The shadow creatures turned toward her as one, their eyeless faces somehow conveying surprise and hunger in equal measure. But they did not retreat. Instead, they moved toward her with that same fluid grace, recognizing her as either a threat to be eliminated or a prize to be claimed. Lyra backed against the crystal barrier, feeling its warmth against her shoulders as the protective magic flickered more weakly with each passing second. Then something inside her chest cracked open like an egg. Power flooded through her veins like molten silver, ancient and vast and terrifyingly beautiful. Her wolf surged upward from the depths where it had been imprisoned, not to shift her body, but to merge with her consciousness in a way that felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile. Suddenly she could see the shadow creatures for what they truly were. could sense the dark magic that animated them and the malevolent intelligence that had sent them here. And she could feel the bonds that had suppressed her power her entire life shattering like glass under the pressure of her desperate need. The crystal of echoes responded to her awakening with a pulse of radiance that filled the chamber with noon-bright silver light. The shadow creatures reeled backward, their forms wavering as the lunar magic she was channeling through the artifact burned them like acid. But there were too many of them, and they were adapting too quickly, learning to shield themselves from the worst of the purifying radiance. Lyra raised her hands, and moonlight poured from her palms like water. The sensation was indescribable, power flowing through her with the inevitability of rivers seeking the sea. She could feel the crystal of echoes singing in harmony with her magic, amplifying her abilities and lending her access to forces that had been sleeping in her bloodline for generations. This was what she was meant to be, what someone had stolen from her through magical bonds so subtle she had never even suspected they existed. But the effort was killing her. Each pulse of power that drove back the shadow creatures felt like it was tearing pieces from her soul. Blood ran from her nose, her vision blurred with exhaustion, and she could feel her mortal body beginning to buckle under the strain of channeling forces meant for beings far more powerful than a suppressed temple guardian. Still, she held the line. Because if these creatures claimed the crystal of echoes, if they carried its power back to whatever dark realm had spawned them, the consequences would ripple through every supernatural community in the world. Then she heard footsteps on the stairs, and her heart soared with desperate hope. The Alpha King exploded into the chamber like a force of nature unleashed, his power blazing golden around him as he took in the scene with the tactical assessment of a born warrior. He moved with inhuman speed, his partially shifted form tearing through shadow creatures with claws that blazed with alpha fire. But there were still too many of them, and Lyra could feel her strength failing as the magical effort continued to drain her life force. She was dimming, her silver radiance flickering like a candle in a hurricane, and the protective barrier around the crystal of echoes was beginning to fail entirely. "Hold on!" The Alpha King's voice reached her through the chaos, rough with fury and something that sounded like fear. Just hold on a little longer. But she could not hold on. The power was consuming her from within, burning through her mortal flesh like fire through paper. She had maybe seconds left before her body gave out entirely, and when it did, the shadow creatures would claim both the relic and whatever remained of her soul. Then the Alpha King did something that changed everything. He placed his hand on her shoulder, and his power flowed into her like a river of golden light. The sensation was overwhelming, his alpha strength merging with her lunar magic to create something neither of them could have achieved alone. Where her power had been silver and ethereal, their combined might blazed white-hot with the force of creation itself. The shadow creatures shrieked as the purifying radiance intensified beyond their ability to withstand, their forms dissolving like smoke in a hurricane. But more than that, she could feel something fundamental shifting in the magical bonds that had constrained her power. The Alpha King's strength was not just lending her energy, it was helping her break free from the supernatural prison that someone had built around her soul. With each pulse of their combined magic, more chains snapped, more barriers crumbled, more of her true self emerged from the cage where it had been hidden. The last shadow creature dissolved with a final shriek of frustrated hunger, leaving the relic chamber blazing with silver-gold radiance and the echoes of power that seemed to shake the very foundations of the temple. Lyra collapsed. The Alpha King caught her before she could hit the stone floor, his strong arms pulling her against his chest as waves of magical exhaustion crashed over her. She could feel his heart hammering against her cheek, could sense the way his own power was fluctuating from the effort of channeling forces beyond what either of them had been prepared to handle. But she was alive. They were both alive, and the crystal of echoes sang with renewed vitality behind its restored protective barrier. What were those things? She gasped against his shoulder, her voice barely audible in the aftermath of supernatural combat. Harbingers. His voice was tight with controlled fury and something else that made her chest warm despite her exhaustion. Creatures of shadow and hunger that are drawn to awakening power. Someone sent them here deliberately, knowing that your abilities were beginning to manifest. The implication hit her like a physical blow. Someone had known what was happening to her, had anticipated her power breaking free, and had sent those creatures to either claim her or destroy her before she could become a threat. But who would want to stop me from accessing my own heritage? The Alpha King's grip tightened, and when she looked up at him, she saw his amber eyes blazing with protective fury that made her wolf purr with satisfaction. Someone who has been controlling your bloodline for generations. Someone who profits from keeping you weak and powerless and believing you are nothing. Before she could ask the questions that burned in her throat, voices echoed from the corridor above. The temple guards finally responding to the supernatural disturbance that had shaken the ancient building to its foundations. Soon this chamber would be filled with people demanding explanations, and the fragile intimacy of shared battle would be shattered by political reality. But for just a moment longer, she allowed herself to rest in the Alpha King's arms, feeling safer than she had ever felt in her life, despite the fact that everything she thought she knew about herself had just been proven catastrophically wrong. The crystal of echoes pulsed with gentle silver light, no longer screaming with distress, but singing with the deep contentment of an artifact that had finally found its true purpose. And in her chest, Lyra's wolf settled into watchful alertness, no longer caged, but not yet fully free. Tomorrow was the convergence ceremony, and she was beginning to understand that by the time it ended, the careful balance of power in the supernatural world would be forever changed. The announcement came with all the pomp and ceremony that political necessity demanded, but Lyra heard it like a death knell tolling in her chest. She stood in the shadows at the back of the great hall, invisible among the servants and attendants who had gathered to witness history being made. On the raised dais at the far end of the chamber, the Alpha King and Lady Seraphina posed like figures carved from marble, beautiful and remote and utterly untouchable. It is my honour to announce the formal engagement of His Majesty King Kyle to Lady Seraphina of the Northern Territories. High Priestess Mira's voice carried to every corner of the hall, rich with satisfaction and political triumph. The bonding ceremony will take place tomorrow evening, following the sacred rituals of the convergence. The assembled dignitaries erupted in polite applause, but Lyra barely heard it over the roaring in her ears. Tomorrow evening, less than 24 hours before the man who had awakened something fundamental in her soul would be bound forever to another woman. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall, fighting the urge to run from the hall before the carefully controlled mask of indifference she wore could crack entirely. Her wolf paced restlessly in the cage of her ribs, whining with distress that felt like physical pain. But worse than the wolf's anguish was the way the Alpha King's eyes found hers across the crowded hall, amber depths blazing with an emotion she recognized because it was tearing her apart as well. He looked like a man walking to his own execution, resigned to a fate that would destroy everything he had discovered he wanted. Lady Seraphina, resplendent in silk the colour of fresh blood, smiled with the perfect composure of someone who had never doubted that she would get everything she desired. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the hall with crystalline clarity. I am deeply honoured by His Majesty's choice, and I look forward to serving the realm as his queen and the mother of his heirs. Each word hit Lyra like a blade between the ribs. Queen, heirs, a future that stretched out before them like a golden road, paved with everything Lyra could never be and would never have. The formal presentation continued, with discussions of dowries and territorial agreements, but Lyra stopped listening. Instead, she slipped from the hall through servant corridors that led to the one place where she could breathe without feeling like she was suffocating on her own inadequacy. The relic chamber welcomed her like an old friend, its familiar shadows offering sanctuary from the harsh reality of political marriages and royal duty. But even here, she could not escape the weight of what was coming. Tomorrow evening, while the Alpha King bound himself to Lady Seraphina, Lyra would be required to present the Crystal of Echoes as part of the ceremonial blessing. She would have to stand before them and watch her heart break in real time. The crystal pulsed with gentle silver light as she approached, its song softer now but no less beautiful. Since the attack by the shadow creatures, the relic had been different, more responsive, more alive, as if the violence had awakened something that had been sleeping in its crystalline depths, much like what was happening to her. Lyra placed her palm against the protective barrier, feeling the warm hum of power that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Over the past few days, she had felt the supernatural bonds that constrained her abilities continuing to weaken. Each time she touched the crystal, each time her power resonated with its ancient magic, more chains snapped free. But what was the point of awakening power she would never be allowed to use? What good was discovering her true heritage if she was destined to spend the rest of her life watching the Alpha King love someone else? The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted her spiral into self-pity, but when she turned expecting to see a temple guard or curious acolyte, she found Lady Seraphina herself descending into the chamber. The future queen moved with liquid grace, her midnight hair arranged in an elaborate style that spoke of hours of careful preparation, her blue eyes sharp with the kind of intelligence that missed nothing and forgave even less. She was everything Lyra was not: beautiful, powerful, politically valuable, worthy of an Alpha King's attention. "So this is where you hide when the real world becomes too much to bear." Lady Seraphina's voice was like honey poured over steel, sweet on the surface but deadly underneath. "How pathetically appropriate, your ladyship!" Lyra dropped into a curtsy that felt clumsy and insufficient. "I did not realize you were interested in the temple's sacred artifacts." "Oh, I am not." Lady Seraphina moved closer, and with each step Lyra felt the temperature in the chamber seem to drop. "I am interested in you, little guardian. Specifically, I am interested in understanding why my intended mate keeps finding excuses to visit this dusty chamber and its even dustier keeper." The words hung in the air like a blade poised to fall, loaded with implications that made Lyra's mouth go dry with fear. Because if Lady Seraphina had noticed the Alpha King's attention, if she suspected the impossible connection that had formed between them, then everything was about to become infinitely more dangerous. "His Majesty has shown scholarly interest in the Crystal of Echoes," Lyra said carefully, because it was safer than acknowledging the other truth that pulsed between them like a living thing. "The relic's recent activity has raised questions about its historical significance. Has it?" Lady Seraphina's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. How interesting that an artifact which has been dormant for centuries would suddenly begin showing signs of power just as my engagement is announced, almost as if something was trying to interfere with the natural order of things. She moved closer, close enough that Lyra could smell the expensive perfume that clung to her perfect skin, close enough to see the cold calculation in her blue eyes. "Let me be very clear about something, little guardian. Tomorrow evening I will become queen. Kyle will be my mate, my husband, the father of my children. And anyone foolish enough to believe they can interfere with that destiny will discover exactly how creative I can be when it comes to eliminating obstacles." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, delivered with the kind of casual certainty that spoke of someone who had never been denied anything she wanted. Lyra felt ice settle in her stomach because she recognized the look in Lady Seraphina's eyes. She had seen it in the faces of every predator she had ever encountered, the cold assessment of prey that had been marked for destruction. "I understand, your ladyship." "Good." Lady Seraphina's smile widened, and for just a moment Lyra could have sworn she saw something inhuman flickering in the depths of those perfect blue eyes, because it would be such a tragedy if something happened to you before the ceremony. Accidents are so common around ancient temples, are they not? Stone falls, mysterious illnesses, unfortunate encounters with unstable magic. She turned to leave, her silk gown whispering against the stone floor like the sound of scales on rock. But at the archway she paused and looked back over her shoulder. Oh, and little guardian, the ceremonial presentation tomorrow evening will require you to remain in close proximity to the crystal throughout the entire bonding ritual. I do hope your constitution proves strong enough to handle such prolonged exposure to its power. It would be such a shame if the effort proved too much for your fragile mortal frame. Then she was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive perfume and the echoing promise of violence wrapped in silk and politeness. Lyra sank to her knees before the crystal of echoes, her whole body shaking with the aftermath of fear and fury in equal measure. The threat had been clear enough. Participate in the ceremony that would bind the Alpha King to his political bride, or face consequences that would likely prove fatal. But as she knelt there in the silver radiance of the ancient artifact, something else began to build in her chest. Not just terror at Lady Seraphina's promised retribution, but anger. Fierce, burning anger at being treated like a disposable obstacle, at having her life threatened because she had committed the crime of existing in the same space as a man who was supposedly beyond her reach. The crystal of echoes pulsed brighter, responding to the shift in her emotional state. And with its brightening light came whispers, voices so faint she might have imagined them, speaking in a language that predated human civilization but somehow felt as familiar as her own heartbeat. Power calls to power, the voices seemed to say. Blood calls to blood. And when the moon is full and the ancient ways are honoured, even the strongest chains can be broken. Tomorrow was the night of the full moon. Tomorrow was the convergence ceremony, when the supernatural world would gather to renew the bonds that held their reality together. And tomorrow, Lyra was beginning to understand, everything would change. Her wolf lifted its head in the cage of her ribs and howled, but this time the sound was not one of despair. This time it carried the promise of recognition finally claimed, of power finally awakened, of a destiny that no political marriage could constrain. The crystal of echoes sang in harmony with her wolf's call, and in its ethereal music Lyra heard the echo of choices that would reshape the world. The night of the convergence arrived with the weight of destiny hanging in the air like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Lyra stood in the depths of the temple, preparing herself for what might be the last ritual she would ever perform as guardian of the crystal of echoes. The ancient artifact blazed with silver fire behind its protective barrier, more alive than she had ever seen it, as if it too could sense the significance of what was about to unfold above in the ceremonial halls. Throughout the temple complex she could hear the sounds of preparation. Hundreds of supernatural dignitaries had arrived for the convergence, the most powerful beings from across the known world gathering to renew the ancient pacts that maintained the delicate balance between their realm and the mortal one. Werewolf alphas, vampire lords, fey nobility, witch covens, and creatures whose names were spoken only in whispers moved through the sacred spaces with the casual authority of those who shaped reality through will alone. And tonight, in the culmination of the 7-year cycle, they would witness the Alpha King bind himself to Lady Seraphina in a political marriage that would secure alliances and ensure peace for generations to come. Tonight, Lyra's heart would break in front of the most powerful supernatural beings in existence. She had dressed in the ceremonial robes of her station, simple white linen that marked her as a servant of the ancient ways rather than a participant in the grand theatre of politics. The crystal of echoes would be her burden to bear during the ritual, carried before the assembly as a symbol of the old power that still flowed through the world despite centuries of dormancy. At least, that was what everyone believed. But as Lyra approached the protective barrier, she could feel the truth humming in her bones. The crystal was not dormant, had never been truly dormant. It had been waiting for the right bloodline, the right moment, the right convergence of power and necessity to awaken fully to its ancient purpose. And that moment was tonight. The artifact pulsed brighter as she drew near, its song rising to harmonies that seemed to resonate in the very stones of the temple. But this time there was something different in its ethereal music. Urgency, warning, a sense of impending catastrophe that made her wolf pace frantically beneath her skin. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The realization hit her with the force of prophecy, certainty that blazed through her consciousness without explanation or context. The convergence ceremony was meant to renew the bonds that held their world in balance. But tonight something would happen that would threaten to tear those bonds apart entirely. She could feel it in the way the crystal's light flickered with patterns that hurt to look at directly, could sense it in the way her suppressed power strained against the weakening chains that held it captive. The shadow creatures from 2 nights ago had not been random attackers seeking to steal the relic. They had been harbingers, sent to test the strength of the barriers that contained forces too dangerous to be allowed free rein. And tonight, during the most sacred ceremony of their supernatural calendar, those barriers were going to fail. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted her growing panic, but when she turned expecting to see a temple guard come to escort her to the ceremony, she found the Alpha King himself descending into the chamber. He was magnificent in his formal regalia, every inch the powerful ruler who commanded the respect and fear of the supernatural world. But when their eyes met across the silver-lit space, she saw past the ceremonial armour to the man beneath. A man who looked like he was walking to his own execution, trapped by duty and political necessity into a fate that would destroy everything he had discovered he wanted. "You feel it too." His voice was rough with an emotion she could not name, and when he moved closer to the crystal, she saw the way its radiance seemed to bend toward him like a plant seeking sunlight. Something is building toward catastrophe tonight. Lyra nodded, not trusting her voice in the face of his overwhelming presence, because she could feel it, had been feeling it with growing intensity as the full moon rose toward its zenith. Power was gathering in ways that defied the careful controls that had maintained supernatural stability for centuries. "The crystal is trying to warn us," she whispered, because speaking louder felt like it might shatter the fragile moment between them. "But I do not understand what it is trying to say." The Alpha King moved to stand beside her before the protective barrier, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his powerful frame, could smell the masculine scent that made her wolf keen with desperate longing. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of terrible certainty. "It is trying to tell us that the convergence ceremony is not what it appears to be, that someone has been planning this night for a very long time, and what they intend will reshape the supernatural world in ways that serve their agenda rather than the greater good." The implications crashed over her like ice water. The ceremony that brought together the most powerful beings from across their realm, that renewed the ancient bonds holding reality stable, was somehow being used as a weapon against the very people it was meant to protect. But who would dare attempt such a thing, and how? Before he could answer, the crystal's song shifted to something that sounded like screaming, not audible sound, but psychic agony that crashed over them in waves, making Lyra gasp and the Alpha King snarl with protective fury. The silver light within the artifact began to strobe erratically, and she could see shapes moving within its crystalline depths that should not have been possible. Then she heard it. Voices from the ceremonial hall above, raised not in celebration but in panic and confusion, shouts of alarm, the sound of chairs overturning, the unmistakable crash of supernatural powers being unleashed in violence rather than ceremony. The convergence ceremony had begun, and something had already gone catastrophically wrong. The Alpha King's hand found her shoulder. his touch sending bolts of recognition through her entire nervous system. When she looked up at him, she saw his amber eyes blazing with the kind of fury that could reshape kingdoms. I have to go. My presence is required for the ritual binding, and if I am absent, it will only make whatever chaos is unfolding above even worse. But even as he said it, Lyra could see the conflict tearing him apart, duty demanding that he go to Lady Seraphina and complete the political marriage that would secure his kingdom's future. His heart demanding that he stay here with her and face whatever supernatural crisis was building in the depths of an ancient artifact that seemed to recognize him as its destined partner. "Go," she said, though the words felt like swallowing glass. "Lady Seraphina will be waiting, and the alliance cannot be delayed further." His grip on her shoulder tightened, and for just a moment she thought he might refuse. Might choose to stay in the depths of the temple with a powerless guardian instead of fulfilling his obligations to crown and country. Then more sounds of chaos echoed from above, and the moment shattered. "But this is not over," he said, his voice rough with promise and something that sounded like defiance. "Whatever is happening tonight, whatever forces are moving against us, we will face them together." He left her then, climbing the stairs toward a ceremony that would bind him to another woman, while the crystal of echoes screamed warnings that no one else seemed able to hear. But his words echoed in the chamber long after his footsteps faded, and in their promise Lyra heard the echo of choices that could not be constrained by political necessity. The crystal's light pulsed brighter, and this time when she looked into its depths she could see them clearly. Shapes that moved with malevolent purpose, reaching toward the barriers that contained them with claws made of shadow and hunger. The same creatures that had attacked 2 nights ago, but now there were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, pressing against the boundaries of their prison with growing desperation. And with each pulse of supernatural power from the ceremony above, those barriers grew weaker. Lyra pressed her palms against the protective shell surrounding the artifact, feeling the ancient magic that held it stable flickering under pressures it had never been designed to withstand. The convergence ceremony was supposed to strengthen the bonds that held their world in balance, but instead it was feeding power directly to forces that wanted nothing more than to tear those bonds apart. Someone had corrupted the ritual. Someone had turned their most sacred ceremony into a weapon that would destroy everything it was meant to protect. And she was the only one who could see it happening. Above her, she could hear the sounds of the formal bonding beginning, High Priestess Mira's voice rising in the ancient words that would join 2 bloodlines in political alliance. The Alpha King and Lady Seraphina, united before the assembled supernatural world, while ancient power gathered for an assault that would leave their reality in ruins. The crystal of echoes pulsed one more time, and in its silver radiance Lyra saw the truth that would reshape everything. The shadow creatures were not trying to break into their world from outside. They were already here, had been here all along, feeding on the power of the ceremony itself. And the woman who was about to become queen, the perfect political bride who would secure the Alpha King's future, was the one who had opened the door for them. The world ended with the sound of crystal shattering like 1,000 bells tolling the apocalypse. Lyra felt it the moment the Alpha King's hand touched the ceremonial chalice above, the moment his power merged with Lady Seraphina's in the ancient binding ritual that was supposed to unite their bloodlines in political alliance. The resonance hit her like a physical blow, travelling down through stone and spellwork to crash against the crystal of echoes with the force of a tidal wave. The protective barrier around the relic flickered once, twice, then shattered entirely, and the crystal of echoes screamed, not with sound, but with 3 centuries of suppressed power erupting outward in cascades of silver fire that turned the chamber into a maelstrom of supernatural energy. Lyra threw herself backward as shards of crystallized moonlight exploded through the space where she had been standing, each fragment blazing with enough magical force to level buildings. But something was wrong. Something was very wrong, because the power pouring from the shattered relic was not the pure lunar magic she had expected. It was tainted, corrupted, shot through with veins of darkness that writhed like living things among the silver radiance. The shadow creatures she had seen trapped within the crystal's depths came pouring out like a plague of nightmares made manifest. Hundreds of them, thousands, creatures of hunger and malevolence that had been feeding on the relic's power for generations, growing stronger and more numerous with each passing year of imprisonment, and now they were free. Lyra scrambled to her feet, her ceremonial robes torn and bloodied from the crystal fragments, her mind reeling from the magnitude of the catastrophe that was unfolding around her. The shadow creatures paid her no attention, streaming through the chamber toward the stairs that led to the ceremonial halls above, toward the assembled supernatural dignitaries who had no idea what was coming for them, toward the Alpha King. She ran after them, taking the stairs 3 at a time, as terror lent her speed she had never known she possessed. Behind her, she could hear the sound of stone cracking as the magical explosion continued to tear through the temple's foundations, ancient spells that had held the building stable for millennia, failing under the assault of corrupted power. But worse than the physical destruction was the psychic anguish that crashed over her in waves, pain that felt like it was tearing pieces from her soul, agony that spoke of supernatural bonds being severed with violent force. The Crystal of Echoes had not just been a repository of lunar magic. It had been the anchor point for magical constraints that kept far more dangerous forces in check. And now those constraints were gone. She reached the main ceremonial hall to find chaos beyond description. The assembled supernatural dignitaries were locked in battle with creatures that should not have been able to exist in their realm, shadow things that moved with fluid grace and struck with claws that could tear through reality itself. Tables had been overturned, ancient tapestries burned by supernatural fire, and the air itself crackled with so much unleashed power that it hurt to breathe. At the centre of the maelstrom, the Alpha King fought with the desperate fury of a man protecting everything he held sacred. His partially shifted form blazed with golden fire as he tore through shadow creatures with claws that could rend steel. But for every monster he destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. And beside him, Lady Seraphina stood with her perfect composure entirely intact, watching the carnage with the detached interest of someone observing a particularly engaging theatrical performance. The truth hit Lyra like a physical blow, certainty that blazed through her consciousness with the force of divine revelation. Lady Seraphina was not surprised by the attack because she had orchestrated it. The corruption in the Crystal of Echoes, the shadow creatures that had been feeding on its power, the timing of their release during the most sacred ceremony of their supernatural calendar, all of it had been planned. But more than that, she could see the way Lady Seraphina's perfect blue eyes reflected the chaos around her, could sense the way her power resonated with the shadow creatures rather than repelling them. She was not just their ally, she was their queen. The political marriage, the alliance between kingdoms, the careful negotiations that had brought together the most powerful supernatural beings in existence, all of it had been a trap designed to gather their enemies in one place where they could be destroyed simultaneously. Lyra tried to shout a warning, tried to scream the truth to anyone who would listen, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of supernatural combat. Around her, werewolf alphas and vampire lords and fey nobility fought for their lives against creatures that grew stronger with each life they claimed, each drop of powerful blood they spilled. And in the centre of it all, the Alpha King continued his desperate battle, unaware that the woman he had just bound himself to was the architect of his destruction. Then Lyra felt it, power stirring in the depths of her being, ancient and vast and terrifyingly beautiful. The magical constraints that had held her abilities captive her entire life were finally crumbling entirely, weakened by years of gradual erosion and shattered completely by the explosion of corrupted energy from the crystal of echoes. Her wolf surged upward from the cage where it had been imprisoned, merging with her consciousness in a way that felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile. But this was not the ordinary beast spirit that lived within all of her kind. This was something far older, far more powerful, touched by divinity and marked with the silver fire of the moon goddess herself. She was not just a werewolf. She was not even just a descendant of the ancient guardian bloodline. She was the Moon Daughter, the last living heir to the goddess's own power, hidden and suppressed and disguised as a powerless temple servant to protect her from forces that would destroy her if they knew what she truly was. And now, as the supernatural world burned around her, that protection was finally being stripped away. The transformation began with pain that felt like her bones were being reformed from molten silver. Every cell in her body screamed as divine power flooded through her mortal frame, rewriting her very essence to accommodate forces that no ordinary being was meant to contain. She could feel her physical form beginning to change, not into the wolf shape that was her species' birthright, but into something that existed between mortal and divine, touched by moonlight and marked with the goddess's own blessing. Silver light poured from her skin like liquid starfire, so bright that the shadow creatures recoiled with shrieks of pain and rage. The assembled supernatural dignitaries turned to stare as she rose into the air, supported by currents of lunar magic that bent reality around her transformed presence. And in the centre of the chaos, the Alpha King looked up and saw her hovering above the battlefield like an avenging angel, wrapped in moonlight and divine fury. His eyes widened with recognition that went deeper than mere sight, acknowledgement of a truth that resonated in the depths of his soul. Not just mate, though the bond between them blazed like a star being born. Something far more significant, far more dangerous to the carefully maintained balance of power in their world. She was the Moon Daughter, the goddess's chosen heir, prophesied to return when the supernatural world faced its darkest hour. The being whose awakening would either save their reality or reshape it so completely that nothing would ever be the same. Lady Seraphina's perfect composure finally cracked, her beautiful features twisting into something inhuman as she stared up at the transformed guardian floating in a nimbus of silver fire. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that belonged to creatures that had never known the light of any sun. Impossible. The bloodline was broken. The power was contained. You should not exist. But Lyra did exist, and as her consciousness expanded to encompass abilities that had been sleeping in her heritage for 1,000 years, she began to understand the scope of the deception that had shaped her entire life. The Moon Daughter bloodline had not been broken. It had been deliberately hidden, the power contained not to protect the world from her abilities, but to protect her from enemies who would stop at nothing to prevent her awakening. Enemies like the creature that wore Lady Seraphina's perfect face. She descended toward the battlefield, her power blazing brighter with each heartbeat as she prepared to face the truth that had been waiting in the shadows of her bloodline for generations. The shadow creatures pressed closer, their hunger for divine essence driving them to desperate attacks, despite the agony her radiance caused them. But they were not her real enemy. The real enemy stood beside the Alpha King with borrowed beauty and stolen identity, watching the chaos she had orchestrated with eyes that reflected the void between stars. The crystal of echoes was gone, shattered beyond repair in the explosion that had set ancient evils free. But its purpose had been fulfilled. The Moon Daughter had awakened at last, and the supernatural world would never be the same. The Moon Daughter rose from the ashes of her former life like silver fire given form, and the supernatural world trembled before power that had been sleeping for 1,000 years. Lyra descended into the chaos of the ceremonial hall, with moonlight streaming from her transformed body, her feet touching the blood-soaked stones as creatures of shadow recoiled from her divine radiance. She no longer looked entirely human, her mortal flesh refined by goddess-touched power until she seemed carved from starlight itself. Her hair flowed like liquid silver, her eyes blazed with the cold fire of winter moons, and when she moved, it was with the fluid grace of something that existed between the mortal realm and the celestial sphere. The assembled supernatural dignitaries stared in awe and terror as recognition rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Ancient bloodlines, older than recorded history, carried memories in their bones of what it meant when the Moon Daughter walked among them. She was legend made manifest, prophecy fulfilled, the goddess's own heir awakened to reclaim power that had been stolen from the world. But more than that, she was furious. "You dare!" Her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in the very foundations of reality, each word dripping with divine wrath that made the strongest supernatural beings present flinch instinctively. "You dare corrupt the sacred rites, pollute the ancient ceremonies, and turn our most holy gathering into an abattoir for your hunger." Lady Seraphina's perfect mask finally fell away entirely, revealing the creature that had been hiding beneath stolen beauty. Her form shifted and flowed like smoke given substance, beautiful one moment and horrifying the next, as if she could not quite maintain the illusion of humanity in the presence of true divine power. When she spoke, her voice carried the cold emptiness of the void between stars. "The old ways were ending regardless, Moon Daughter. I merely chose to accelerate the process rather than watch your kind dwindle into irrelevance over centuries of careful decline." Around them, the shadow creatures pressed closer, despite the agony that Lyra's radiance caused them, driven by their queen's will and the promise of feeding on divine essence. But as they moved within range of her power, something extraordinary began to happen. They began to dissolve, not destroyed but purified, their corrupted forms burning away to reveal the souls that had been trapped within shadowy prisons for generations. Werewolves, vampires, fae, witches, supernatural beings who had been captured and twisted into instruments of darkness, their true selves hidden beneath layers of magical corruption until they had forgotten what they once were. Lyra felt their recognition wash over her in waves of desperate gratitude, felt the way her lunar magic called to the divine spark that existed within every supernatural soul. This was her true power, not destruction, but restoration, not conquest, but liberation. She was the Moon Daughter, and it was her purpose to heal the wounds that darkness had carved into the world. But Lady Seraphina snarled with inhuman rage as she watched her army being stripped away from her, her perfect features twisting into something that belonged in nightmares. The corruption that had created the shadow creatures was her work, her masterpiece of magical perversion that had taken centuries to perfect. Enough. You may be the goddess's heir, but you are still mortal flesh wrapped around immortal power, and mortal flesh can be broken. She raised her hands, and darkness poured from her palms like liquid night, shadows that moved with malevolent purpose and struck with the force of falling mountains. The attack hit Lyra's protective aura and exploded into cascades of silver fire, but she could feel the impact reverberating through her newly awakened abilities. Lady Seraphina was right about one thing. Despite her divine heritage, despite the goddess-touched power that blazed through her transformed form, she was still learning to control abilities that had been suppressed her entire life. She was powerful beyond mortal comprehension, But she was also inexperienced, untrained, vulnerable in ways that her enemy was already beginning to exploit. The Shadow Queen pressed her advantage, pouring more darkness into her assault as she sought the cracks in Lyra's defences. But before she could find the opening she needed, golden fire blazed across the battlefield as the Alpha King threw himself into the fight. His partially shifted form radiated alpha dominance as he tore into Lady Seraphina with claws that blazed with supernatural fury, his protective instincts overriding every political consideration that had once constrained his choices. The mate bond that connected him to Lyra had awakened fully when her true nature was revealed, and now it burned between them like a bridge made of starfire. "She is my mate." His voice carried the absolute authority of an alpha, claiming what belonged to him, declaration that echoed through the supernatural realm with the force of natural law. "And anyone who threatens her will answer to me." But Lady Seraphina only laughed, her form shifting to avoid his attacks with fluid ease. "You still do not understand, do you, Alpha King? The political marriage we just completed was not just ceremony. It was binding magic, blood oath and soul contract, sealed before witnesses from every supernatural realm. You are mine now, body and spirit, whether you accept it or not." The words hit him like a physical blow, because underneath her inhuman mockery lay a terrible truth. The ceremony had been completed, the ritual binding sealed with his own power, before the corruption was revealed. Supernatural law recognized the marriage as valid, which meant that claiming Lyra as his mate would require him to break oath bonds that carried consequences beyond mortal comprehension. But as Lyra felt his anguish through their newly awakened connection, as she saw the way political duty warred with the mate bond that blazed between them like a living thing, something shifted in her understanding of what the Moon Daughter was truly meant to be. She was not just a healer. She was not just the goddess's heir awakened to restore balance to the world. She was the being who could rewrite the laws that bound the supernatural realm when those laws no longer served the cause of truth and justice. No, the word carried divine authority that made reality itself pause to listen. "I do not accept the binding. I do not recognize the ceremony. I do not acknowledge any law that places political convenience above the sacred recognition of true mates." She raised her hands, and silver fire poured from her palms like a river of liquid starlight. But this time her power was not directed at Lady Seraphina or her remaining shadow creatures. Instead, she reached out with abilities that touched the very foundations of supernatural law, seeking the magical contract that bound the Alpha King to his political bride. And when she found it, she tore it apart with the casual ease of someone ripping paper. The backlash hit the ceremonial hall like a shockwave, reality rippling as ancient laws bent and reshaped themselves around the Moon Daughter's will. Every supernatural being present felt the moment when the political marriage dissolved, when oath bonds that should have been unbreakable crumbled like dust before divine authority. Lady Seraphina screamed with fury that shook the stones of the temple, her carefully laid plans unravelling as the supernatural world reorganised itself around new truths. But her scream cut off abruptly as the Alpha King's claws found her throat, his golden fire blazing so brightly that the remaining shadow creatures fled rather than face his unleashed wrath. "You made one critical mistake," he snarled against her ear as his claws tightened around her neck. "You threatened my mate, and that is a crime that carries only one punishment." But before he could deliver the killing blow, Lyra's voice stopped him with gentle authority that carried more power than any command. "Wait, let me see her true face before she dies." She approached the captured Shadow Queen, with moonlight streaming around her like a cloak of woven stars, her divine radiance peeling away the layers of illusion and corruption that Lady Seraphina had wrapped around herself for centuries. What was revealed beneath made even the most hardened supernatural warriors present recoil with instinctive horror. Not a creature of shadow and darkness, but something far worse, a former moon daughter, a sister of the bloodline who had been corrupted by the very power she was meant to protect. Her beauty was real, but it was the terrible beauty of divine light turned inward and twisted into something that fed on the destruction of everything she had once been sworn to defend. "You were like me once," Lyra said quietly, her voice carrying infinite sadness for the tragedy of what her enemy had become. "What happened to you?" The corrupted moon daughter's perfect features twisted with an emotion that might have been grief, might have been rage, might have been both. "I learned the truth that you are only beginning to discover, sister. The goddess's power is not a gift. It is a curse, and eventually it devours everything you think you are protecting." Then she dissolved into shadows and smoke, escaping the Alpha King's claws and the moon daughter's purifying light, to vanish into whatever realm had spawned her corruption. But her final words echoed in the devastated ceremonial hall long after her presence faded, a warning and a promise that this victory was only the beginning of a much larger war. Lyra stood in the centre of the ruined hall, silver fire still streaming from her transformed form, surrounded by the supernatural dignitaries who were slowly beginning to kneel in recognition of what she had become. The moon daughter had awakened at last, the goddess's heir had claimed her birthright, and the political order that had governed their world for centuries lay in ashes around her feet. But as the Alpha King moved to stand beside her, as she felt the mate bond blazing between them like a bridge built of starlight and golden fire, she began to understand that the hardest part was yet to come. She had shattered the old laws and revealed her true nature. Now she had to build something new from the ruins, something worthy of the power that burned in her veins and the trust that her people were placing in her transformed hands.